Hey there guys, I just wanted to go over some of my notes on the summary and response essays. These notes are based on what I've seen in my on-site classes essays so far, but I'm going to post this for my web classes as well. I think it might be helpful for them because they're getting ready to submit their first essays over the weekend. So if I say something that doesn't make sense to you, it might be because I'm talking to students in my other set of classes, so just try not to get confused. This is kind of an assignment that's pretty common in all sorts of college classes, so I wanted to kind of make sure that you knew how to do it well, not just for this class and this particular assignment, but just in general. It's kind of a helpful type of assignment to be fairly comfortable with, and once you get the hang of it, it's pretty simple. So I did want to start with some general academic writing tips. First, when you introduce people, scholars and writers and whatnot, you want to make sure that you use their first and last names, and then after that you can refer to them by last name only. So this is an example I've pulled from my prospectus from my thesis. So the first time I used Kenneth Burke's name, I said, according to Kenneth Burke, rhetoric is grounded in the notion of identification. And then after that, I just referred to him as Burke. So a subsequent sentence is, Burke calls this uniting of entities through shared ideas or attitudes consubstantiality. So ignore my big, fantastic words here, but the idea is you want to make sure that you tell people, your readers, the first and last names so that they know exactly who you're talking about. And it's also a good idea, especially if you're writing for a general audience, to include credentials, or even for this essay in particular to say author of blah 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 and go ahead and give the title of the article as well, and then they'll know exactly who you're referring to. Using literary present tense. The idea here is that these artistic and rhetorical creations, these essays, literary works, films, paintings, even speeches, they kind of exist in an eternal present. They're always communicating whatever message it is they were communicating when they were being created. So we always refer to them in the present tense. And I hope that makes sense. It's kind of a confusing concept. So this is a really easy fix, and if you look at my samples, I'm only going to read the present tense because it's basically the same thing with a different verb. In Grammar of Motives, Kenneth Burke poses the question, what is involved when we say what people are doing and why they are doing it? So this is a book that was written over half a century ago, but the things that Kenneth Burke says, the things that he's arguing, I'm always going to be referring to them in the present tense because that work kind of exists in perpetuity. So make sure that when you're referring to other articles and things like that, that you're using literary present tense. Use strong and precise verbs. This is sort of a general writing tip, but it's especially important in academic writing because strong verbs tend to make your writing sound much more formal. And if you're writing an argument, it also makes your writing sound, I think, more persuasive. So some examples I have of weaker verbs and some stronger verbs that sort of equal out here are pretty self-explanatory. These specific ones I actually found in actual student papers that I've just graded in the past week or so. So I would suggest using something like claims instead of says, supports rather than backed up or backs up, fabricated instead of made up, analyzes instead of breaks down, begins instead of starts off, discusses instead of talks about. And so I have some other strong verbs here: refute, inquire, reflect, demand, evoke, encourage, promote, develop, recommend, etc. You get the idea. Just try to keep your language in particular and your verbs specifically a little bit more formal and a little bit more precise. You'd be amazed at the effect that will have on a paper. So now turning to this essay in particular, the most common problem that I've seen in the papers that I've graded so far have been really this first thing. You want to keep the emphasis on your argument. Although I am asking you for a summary and a response essay, you're still making an argument. Here's how I feel about this essay and here's why. You're still supporting a claim. So the problem I think a lot of my on-site students have been having is they tend to agree a lot with the essays that we've read. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Agreeing is a perfectly valid response to a written work. But the reason that I wanted to push you to use one of these templates from Chapter 4 of They Say, I Say as a starting point for your thesis statement is because they sort of force you to think about what you're going to be adding to the conversation, as opposed to giving me an essay where you say, you know, so-and-so author says this, and I agree, I think it's a good idea, I like this idea. Instead of giving me, you know, 3 pages of that, what you want to do is bring something new to the table. There should be a reason for your reader to read your paper instead of just going and reading the article that you were writing about, right? So if you look at some of the templates, and They Say, I Say that I agree that blank because my experience blank confirms it. I agree that texting is not damaging the English language because my experience as someone who texts confirms it, or my experience as a mother with children who text confirms it. So you're adding something new to the conversation there. So I hope that makes sense. That was really the most common point of confusion that I saw in this first round of papers. Second, you want your essay to make sense to someone who hasn't read the original article. And this is also sort of good general academic writing advice. You want to usually write to a relatively broad audience, and you want to make sure that someone who's not familiar with your subject matter can still follow your ideas. This is one of the reasons that the summary part of this essay is so important, and why I've been kind of stressing along the way that your summary needs to be objective, it needs to be thorough. You need to not mix your opinions in with that summary, because what you want to do is give somebody who hasn't read that article very early in your paper just a quick recap of what's going on in that article, so that they don't get confused about which ideas are yours, which ideas came from the article. They can just get a really clear picture of what it is you're responding to, and that's an important part of this assignment. A response is not an evaluation. A lot of the papers that I've graded this past week, especially when you get to the conclusion, it seems like you sort of run out of steam a little bit and you don't know what else to write, and so you end by writing, I like this article, or I enjoyed this article, or I thought this was a really interesting idea. As harsh as it may sound, it really doesn't matter whether you liked or enjoyed the article or not, at least not for this particular assignment. An evaluation is a very different type of genre. So what you want to do, perhaps, if you have written something where you've kind of slid off in that direction, redirect your focus and think about talking about whether it's effective. You know, Lithwick's argument is solidly supportive and her evidence is irrefutable, which is just a much more thorough way of kind of saying you liked the paper, the article, but it's a very specific explanation as to why you liked it, because you thought it was effective because of these things. So I hope that sort of makes sense. So when you revise for my on-site classes, you might want to consider that shift. Last but not least, original titles, please. One of the conversations that I tend to have with my on-site classes fairly early on revolves around some of the more common pet peeves of writing teachers specifically, but teachers just more generally. And I've got to say this is really high on the list. The idea here is if you turn in a paper with a title like Summary and Response, it's just not a good impression not a good first impression on your reader. It's the very first thing that they're going to read, except for maybe your heading. And you want to get things off on the right foot. So if somebody, especially a teacher, sees a title like that, the initial thought is going to be, well, this person couldn't take 2 minutes to give their paper an original and interesting title. What are the odds that they spent a decent amount of time and effort on the rest of the paper? So You want to avoid that, especially with teachers, but with other writers in general. You don't see articles and things published very often in magazines and journals with titles like response to blah blah blah. Usually there's at least a little bit more panache to it. That's really all I wanted to go over, and I hope that this is helpful. The idea here was for my on-site students to be able to refer back to this video when they start making their revisions, and I'm hoping that I get it out to my online classes soon enough that they can actually make use of it when they're working on their papers. So I hope it's helpful. Let me know if you like it, especially my online students, and I'm happy to make more.